How to Become an Ungovernable Woman. An audiobook. Every society that has ever existed has built, quietly and without ever putting it to a formal vote, an entire system for governing women who did not want to be governed. This system usually doesn't operate formally. It looks like etiquette, like family loyalty, like the accusation of being difficult, like 100 small expectations so ordinary they were never questioned, only obeyed. The masses call a woman who refuses this apparatus many things: cold, selfish, unhinged, unmarriageable. History, given enough distance, tends to call her something else entirely: sovereign. The record is full of women who were governed by no institution, no husband, no council of disapproving relatives, and who were despised for it in their own century and studied for it in every century since. This is not a record of rebellion for its own sake. Rebellion without architecture is simply noise, and noise gets crushed quickly, usually before lunch. What survives, what actually rewrites the terms under which a woman is allowed to exist, is something colder and more deliberate. A woman who has built her own legislature, who obeys her own code, and who has made the cost of governing her so high that everyone around her quietly stops trying. This is the art of becoming ungovernable, not loud, not chaotic, simply unownable by any party who assumed ownership was theirs to claim. 10 laws follow. Study them as you studied the last set, not as inspiration, but as architecture. The first law: your attention is sovereign territory. Isabella d'Este ran a Renaissance court while her husband was held prisoner of war, and she ran it so effectively that ambassadors began addressing their correspondence to her instead of to the absent marquis, whose name technically still held the title. She did this while managing a household, a treasury, an army's provisioning, and a constant stream of demands from relatives who believed her attention belonged to whichever of them shouted loudest that week. Her method was unglamorous and entirely replicable. She decided in advance what deserved her focus, and she declined to renegotiate that decision every time someone else's urgency tried to override it. This is the first and most foundational law of ungovernability, because attention is the resource every other form of control depends on. A woman whose attention can be hijacked by any sufficiently dramatic demand has handed over her actual sovereignty, regardless of what title she holds or what boundaries she claims to have on paper. The masses treat every request for their attention as a bill that must be paid immediately on the requester's schedule, regardless of its size. This produces a life governed entirely by other people's emergencies, most of which, examined honestly, were never emergencies at all, simply preferences dressed up with urgency, because urgency is more effective at extracting compliance than a plain request would be. The ungovernable woman treats her attention the way a sovereign nation treats its borders, crossable by invitation, not by demand. A message marked urgent by its sender does not automatically become urgent for its recipient. A relative's disapproval of a decision does not obligate an immediate defense of that decision. The moment you notice yourself dropping what matters to you because someone else declared their want more important than your plan, you have already surrendered the first and most valuable territory you own. Translate this into an ordinary Tuesday. A coworker sends a message flagged urgent about a task that could, on closer inspection, wait until tomorrow. A family member calls mid-project, expecting an immediate answer to a question that has been sitting unresolved for months and could sit for one more day. A man who has shown no consistent interest for weeks suddenly reappears and expects instant availability, as though absence never happened. In every case, the test is the same. Does this deserve to reroute my actual priorities, or does it simply want to? The ungovernable woman answers that question before she answers the message. The second law: state the boundary. Once, then let silence enforce it. Njinga of Ndongo and Matamba, ruling in the 17th century in what is now Angola, was received by a Portuguese colonial governor who had arranged the meeting deliberately so that she would have to stand while he remained seated, an old and unsubtle trick for establishing who outranked whom in the room. She did not protest, did not argue, did not request a chair. She had one of her own attendants kneel on the floor and sat on the attendant's back for the length of the entire negotiation, conducting the meeting at exactly the governor's eye level, as though the insult had simply never been attempted. This is the law in its purest form. The boundary was never announced. It was simply enforced, immediately, without a request for permission, and without a debate about whether it was reasonable. She did not explain why she deserved to sit. She simply arranged the room so that she did, and continued the conversation, as though the matter had never been in question. The masses announce boundaries the way a nation announces a proposed law, as an opening bid for negotiation, inviting counter-argument, inviting the other party to explain why the boundary is unreasonable, inviting an entire debate about its validity. A boundary that can be argued with was never a boundary. It was a suggestion wearing a boundary's clothing. The ungovernable woman states a limit once, briefly, without justification attached, and then treats any further discussion of it as closed business rather than an open agenda item. If someone continues to push after the boundary has been stated, the response is not a longer explanation. It is silence, distance, or in Jinga's case, simply rearranging the terms of the room so the violation becomes structurally impossible to repeat. In practice, this looks unremarkable from the outside, which is exactly why it works. A relative repeats an invasive question already declined once. The answer is not a more detailed refusal, but a change of subject, delivered without tension, as though the question had simply evaporated. A partner tests a limit that was already made clear, arriving late without warning, making a decision that was supposed to be joint. And the response is not a renewed argument, but a quiet adjustment of trust, visible in behavior rather than announced in words. The boundary was already spoken. It does not need to be spoken again to be enforced. The third law: build immunity to the opinions of people who never respected you anyway. Theodora entered the imperial palace of Byzantium from a background so far beneath the aristocracy that the Senate never stopped whispering about it, even after she was crowned empress beside Justinian. Nothing she did erased the whispering. What changed the outcome was that she stopped requiring it to stop. During the Nika riots, when the city had turned to open rebellion and Justinian's own advisors were preparing an escape by sea, it was Theodora who was remembered for refusing to flee, arguing that a life spent running from disapproval she could never fully extinguish was a worse fate than facing the disapproval directly and losing. The emperor stayed, the rebellion was crushed, and the Senate that had spent years disparaging her origin never again seriously questioned her authority. The masses spend enormous energy trying to win over people who made their disapproval a permanent feature of the relationship long before any specific offense was committed. This energy is uniquely wasted because approval that was never actually available for the winning cannot be earned through better behavior. It can only be performed for endlessly at the cost of the performer's actual authority. The ungovernable woman makes a cold, early distinction between disapproval that carries useful information and disapproval that exists simply because her existence was never going to be approved of by that particular party, regardless of what she did. The first kind is worth examining. The second kind is noise, and noise does not require a response, an explanation, or a single further ounce of energy spent trying to convert it. Consider the ordinary version of this: a family member who has criticized every decision for 20 years, regardless of outcome, offering an opinion on the latest one. A former colleague, never an ally, weighing in on a career move with thinly veiled disapproval. The content of their objection is irrelevant, because their verdict was written long before the specific decision existed. The ungovernable woman learns to hear the tone before the words, recognizing standing disapproval for what it is, and spends her explanations only on people whose opinion was ever actually available to change. The fourth law: own something. No one else can repossess. Livia Drusilla, wife of the first Roman emperor, maintained property, business interests, and a network of loyalties entirely her own, independent of her husband's authority. at a time when a Roman woman's legal existence was formally attached to a male guardian for nearly her entire life. She built this independence quietly, through decades of patient accumulation rather than any single dramatic seizure of power, and by the time Augustus died, her influence extended well past what any title on paper described. This is the material foundation beneath every other law in this record, because sovereignty that depends entirely on another person's continued goodwill is not sovereignty. It is an extended loan, callable at any time on terms you did not set. The masses often treat financial and material dependence as a romantic gesture, evidence of trust, of partnership, of not needing to keep score. Examined coldly, dependence of this kind is simply risk concentrated in a single counterparty, and counterparties change their minds, die, leave, or become someone worth leaving. A woman whose entire material world is owned by someone else has handed that person a form of governance no argument about boundaries or attention can undo. The ungovernable woman builds and protects something: income, property, a skill the market pays for independently, a network of her own, that cannot be repossessed by the end of a relationship, a falling out with family, or the withdrawal of anyone's favor. This is not cynicism about love. It is simply the refusal to let love be the only structure holding up the roof. This does not require wealth to begin. It requires a single account no one else has access to, a skill developed independently of any one employer or partner's goodwill, a friendship maintained on its own terms rather than inherited through someone else's relationships. The specific asset matters less than the principle underneath it. If the entire structure of your life depends on one person's continued approval, that person has been handed a form of governance no conversation about boundaries can undo. The fifth law: keep a room no one else can open. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt as pharaoh, commissioned monuments that quietly rewrote the terms of her own legitimacy, and left behind an image of herself constructed with such deliberate control that scholars are still, thousands of years later, debating which parts of the record reflect fact and which reflect a narrative she built on purpose. She understood that the version of herself available to the public record did not need to be the complete version, and that the gap between the two was itself a form of protection. The masses, particularly women trained since girlhood toward likability, tend to treat total transparency as a virtue owed to everyone who asks for it. Every friend, every family member, every partner, entitled, apparently, to the complete contents of an inner life on demand. This produces a woman with no private territory left at all, whose entire interior has been distributed to people who did not necessarily earn access to it, and who will not necessarily protect it once they have it. The ungovernable woman keeps one room in the house locked at all times for no one but herself. Not out of secrecy for its own sake, and not because there is something shameful behind the door, simply because a self with no private territory left is a self entirely available for governance by whoever asks the most persistently. What is kept private cannot be used, weaponized, or governed by anyone else, because no one else knows it exists. In daily terms, this might be as simple as a private ambition not yet announced to a family quick to discourage it, a doubt not confessed to a partner who would use it as leverage, a plan still forming that has not yet been exposed to premature critique. None of this is dishonesty. It is timing, applied to the self the same way it is applied to every other law in this record, disclosed when it serves you, not simply whenever someone asks. The sixth law: refuse the role before you audition for it. Zenobia, ruling the client kingdom of Palmyra on Rome's eastern frontier, was expected to remain exactly what her title suggested: a loyal subordinate, managing a minor territory on the empire's behalf, deferring upward whenever Rome's interests required it. She instead claimed descent from Cleopatra, expanded her territory into Egypt and across much of the Roman East, and behaved, in every practical sense, as an empress in her own right, rather than a governor answering to someone else's throne. Rome eventually crushed the rebellion this provoked, but the historical record does not remember Zenobia as a failed governor who overstepped. It remembers her as a woman who refused a subordinate role so completely that an empire had to mobilize a war to reassert it, which is its own kind of victory, since no one mobilizes an army against someone they consider negligible. The masses accept roles the way a new employee accepts a job description, as a fixed set of expectations to be fulfilled without negotiation, simply because the role was offered, and roles are not typically refused. Good daughter, easy girlfriend, accommodating colleague. Each role comes preloaded with a script, written by someone else, and most people simply begin performing it the moment it's handed to them. The ungovernable woman reads the role she has been assigned before she agrees to perform it, and declines the parts that were written for someone else's convenience rather than her own life. This is not the same as being difficult for its own sake. It is simply refusing to spend a life reciting lines someone else wrote for a character she never agreed to play. Notice how often the role arrives disguised as a compliment. You're so easygoing. You're the reliable one. You never make things difficult. Each of these is a script handed over with praise attached to make the performance feel voluntary. The ungovernable woman notices when a compliment is actually a job description and reserves the right to decline the position even after it has been offered with apparent affection. The seventh law. Let them know you can leave the institution entirely. Grace O'Malley, commanding her own fleet along the west coast of Ireland, negotiated directly with Elizabeth I as something close to an equal. Not a subject requesting mercy, but a sovereign figure discussing terms with another sovereign figure, ship captain to queen. She had spent decades demonstrating, through her actual conduct rather than any formal claim, that English rule over her waters was a proposition she could simply decline to honor whenever it suited her interests. By the time the meeting occurred, both women understood that the alternative to negotiation was not obedience. It was continued defiance, indefinitely, at a cost the Crown had already priced and found too high to keep paying. This is the law that gives every other law its teeth: an institution, a marriage, a family structure, a job, a friend group with unspoken rules, governs you only for as long as leaving it feels unthinkable. The moment leaving becomes not just thinkable, but genuinely available, the institution's leverage collapses, whether or not you ever actually exercise the option. The masses stay inside institutions that no longer serve them because the institution has successfully convinced them that leaving is a catastrophe rather than a choice. This conviction, once installed, does more governing than any explicit rule the institution could write down. The ungovernable woman keeps her exit genuinely available at all times, financially, socially, emotionally, not because she intends to use it constantly, but because an exit that exists only in theory provides no actual leverage. The exit must be real. Everyone around her, on some level, can feel whether it is. This is why an exit rehearsed only in private conversation with friends, never actually prepared for in practice, provides no real leverage at all. Everyone involved consents without being told directly whether an option is genuinely available or simply a comfort spoken aloud to relieve frustration. The ungovernable woman prepares her exits the way a general prepares contingencies, quietly, in advance, whether or not she ever intends to use them, because preparation is what converts a threat into a fact everyone else can feel in the room. The eighth law. Refuse the category. They try to file you under Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi was, in the eyes of the British colonial administration, a widow, a category with a fixed, diminished set of rights, under a doctrine designed specifically to strip authority from women left without a male heir. She was expected to accept the annexation of her kingdom quietly, as the category assigned to her predicted she would. She instead led an armed rebellion against the very doctrine that had tried to define her, and remains remembered not as a widow who lost a kingdom, but as one of the fiercest military commanders of her century. The masses accept the category assigned to them by whichever institution has the power to assign one: widow, single mother, difficult employee, too much, not enough, and spend years living inside the boundaries that category implies, as though the label were a verdict rather than simply someone else's convenient shorthand. The ungovernable woman treats every category offered to her as a proposal, not a sentence. She examines what the label is designed to permit and what it's designed to restrict, and where the restriction serves someone else's convenience rather than her own reality. She declines the entire premise rather than negotiating for slightly better terms within it. The modern version of this label rarely arrives with a legal doctrine attached, but it operates the same way. Too emotional is a category built to discredit a valid grievance before it can be examined on its merits. Not maternal enough, too ambitious for a woman, difficult. Each one exists to pre-sort a person into a box with fewer rights attached than the box next to it. The response is not to argue for a slightly roomier box. It is to refuse the filing system altogether. The 9th law. Let rage be architecture, not performance. Boudica, after suffering direct and personal abuse at the hands of Roman administrators, who believed a woman's grievance carried no political weight, did not respond with an immediate, unplanned outburst. She spent time gathering allies across multiple tribes, coordinating a rebellion large enough to burn 3 Roman settlements before it was finally put down. The anger was unmistakably real. It was also unmistakably engineered, built into a campaign rather than spent in a single unproductive eruption that would have accomplished nothing beyond confirming, to her enemies, that her fury could be dismissed as instability. The masses are taught 2 equally unstrategic options when it comes to anger: suppress it entirely until it leaks out sideways as resentment, or discharge it immediately and visibly, which feels satisfying for exactly as long as the outburst lasts, and typically costs more credibility than the original offense was worth. The ungovernable woman treats rage as raw material rather than as a performance owed to her audience in real time. She feels it completely, in private, and then asks what it should be converted into: a boundary, a departure, a strategy, a rebuilding, before she decides whether, when, or to whom it should ever be shown at all. Anger displayed on demand is anger that has been successfully governed by whoever provoked it. Anger converted into architecture belongs entirely to the woman who felt it first. In an ordinary week, this might mean the difference between an immediate, public response to a slight, satisfying for an hour, remembered as an overreaction for a year, and a quieter recalibration. Reduced access, a changed decision, a boundary. Enforced without ever raising your voice to announce it. The offending party often never even registers the moment the sentence was passed. They simply notice later that something has permanently changed without being able to point to the argument that caused it. The 10th law. Write your own code and answer to no other. Eleanor of Aquitaine ruled in her own right as Duchess before either of her 2 royal marriages began, accompanied a crusade in an era when queens were expected to remain home, managing embroidery and correspondence, was imprisoned for over a decade by a husband she'd conspired against, and emerged from that imprisonment to rule as regent, negotiate her son's successions, and remain, by every account, entirely herself at every stage. Never fully absorbed into the identity of wife of, never fully extinguished by either marriage or captivity. She answered, across nearly 80 years and 2 kingdoms, to a code that appears to have been entirely her own authorship. This is the final law because it is the only one that makes all the others durable rather than situational. A woman who defends her boundaries in one context but abandons them the moment a different authority applies pressure has not actually become ungovernable. She has simply relocated which government she answers to. The woman who is genuinely ungovernable has written her own constitution, privately, and consults it before consulting any external authority's opinion of what she owes them. This does not mean answering to no one. It means being the final signatory on every decision that governs her own life, regardless of how many other parties believed they held veto power. Family, romantic partners, institutions, and public opinion may all offer input. None of them hold the pen. Write this code the way any founding document gets written, in private, in plain language, revised as you learn, but consulted before any external authority's opinion is allowed to overrule it. A woman with no written code of her own will, by default, operate on whichever code the loudest nearby authority hands her. A woman with her own will simply consult it first, every time, and let every other opinion arrive as input, rather than instruction. Closing. On what ungovernable actually means, none of the women named in this record were reckless. Every one of them was, by the accounts of her own contemporaries, disciplined to a degree that looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from control. This is the part the masses consistently misunderstand about the word ungovernable. It was never a synonym for chaos. It is the opposite. A woman so thoroughly governed by her own code that no external authority's code can compete for the position. They will call this cold. They will call it selfish. They called every woman in this record the same things, in her own century, using whatever vocabulary that century had available for a woman who could not be filed, owned, or repossessed. You now have 10 laws. The rest, as always, is a matter of will.